morning, everyone, and welcome to the monthly economic briefing presented by the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. I'm External Affairs Associate Rob Knapp. It's great to have you with us this morning. You may have noticed this is not the first Friday of the month. We did something a little bit different this month. The first Friday was sandwiched between a holiday and a weekend, so we thought we'd give you that week off. We're back here with the second week. There is still plenty to talk about. We did have a jobs report last week. Showed the job market seemed to be cooling. We were at 206,000 jobs added for June. So is this a soft landing? Is this the first step toward a recession? One question we'll talk about this morning. Another one, inflation. So we have inflation coming down to more comfortable levels for the Fed. We had new numbers out this week. So does this mean that the Fed is going to lower interest rates in September? That's the talk. We'll talk about it too. Here to talk about it today is our chief economist, Gerald Cohen. He's going to be on in just a moment. But before that, we'll give you a little bit of run of show just to remind you how things go. Dr. Cohen will give his presentation for the first 15 to 20 minutes of our 30 minutes. After that, we'll open it up to you. Your questions are welcome. You can submit that at any time by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Those of you with us from among the press, please let us know with your question, your organization and title, so that we can prioritize your questions. If you're joining us by phone today, you can ask questions as well. You can email them to me at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. We'll take as many questions as we can before 9:30 Eastern, or maybe a tiny bit after. We squeeze a couple in at the end if we can. We will do our best. I think that's everything you need to know. So it's time to hand it over to the Kenan Institute's chief economist, Gerald Cohen, who, even though we don't have a jobs report this morning, has plenty to talk about.
Good morning, Rob. It felt very leisurely this morning without a report to kind of do a quick analysis of.
It's a different kind of briefing this time. We'll see. We may get used to this. Who knows?
Exactly.
We may want to change things a little.
No, well, I like doing the quick response, but it gave me some more time to analyze the data, and so hopefully our viewers will see the fruits of that labor. So let me start. So good morning, everybody. So actually, this chart, instead of showing you the details of the employment report, because that was fresh, or would have been fresh normally, I wanted to start with actually, I think this chart is a lot. We got inflation data yesterday, which I think is pretty interesting. And B, I think this chart illustrates this gap. Especially if you're from the UK and take the subway minding the Gap, or take the tube, I should say, in London. So this chart shows the blue line shows the level of prices, and it's indexed to $100 if that's what your grocery basket was, or basket of spending was in February of 2020. It was $100, and now that same basket costs for the average U.S. consumer, and I'll talk a bit about that in the future, now $121. And in the month of June, the price of that basket edged down by 0.1%, which is kind of the positive inflation reading. And year-over-year inflation edged down to, or declined to 3% in June. And that's kind of, the blue line is what we think of when we go to the grocery store or when we go shopping. The red line is what economists, and in particular, the orange line is what economists, in particular the Fed, think about, which is, what is the change in prices? And so the Fed is looking at these numbers and saying, inflation is slowing. And in fact, if you kind of do some more math on the data, the 3-month change in prices was up just 1.1%. So the Fed is saying on an annualized basis. So the Fed is saying, if that trend continues, then we're going to have sub 2% inflation. 2% inflation is our target. That's good news. But households are saying, wait, prices are up 21%. And so, that's not in the last 4+ years, and that's not good for me. And so that is an important driver of the gap of kind of the gap in thinking between households and the Fed. And I'll talk a little bit more about the distributional impacts of that gap in a little bit. So, given the time, I got to write some kind of key takeaways. So, per what I just said, inflation is coming down to kind of more comfortable levels for the Fed, but elevated prices are weighing on consumers. And if you saw yesterday's Pepsi earnings announcement, they talked about inflation-weary consumers and the impact on people's purchases of Pepsi products and or the products that Pepsi owns. And so that is definitely an issue that not only households but businesses are grappling with. And again, I'll show some data suggesting that consumers these things are having an impact on consumer spending, which has been a key driver for economic activity. As Rob said, the job market is showing signs of cooling. I'll show you a little bit of data on that. But normally there are very few times when we go from slowdown to soft landing. Often you go from slowdown to recession, and so it's important for me to note that. As I've been on the record for quite a while, I continue to worry about a recession. My colleague Cami Cunin, who did the briefing last month, is more in the soft landing camp. So different people, different views, and that's the beauty of our briefings. You can hear the panoply of views along, from the faculty at Kenan-Flagler and the staff at the Kenan Institute. And then this data does suggest an increasing likelihood of the Fed easing. The markets have now penciled in one cut, or near 90% chance of one cut in September. And by the end of the year, somewhere between 3 and 4 rate cuts. So rates, according to them, based on the markets, will be in the mid to high 4% range, rather than the kind of 5.25% to 5.5% range that the Fed currently sits. So now, as Rob said, we had a strong, 206,000 job report. That blue bar, you could say, well, is that strong? Well, that's strong. That 206,000 is strong relative to kind of demographic trends. You've heard that here from me before. We should be closer to the 100,000 range based on demographics. But what caused this kind of more muddled picture was the fact that we had downward revisions of 111,000 and so in the previous months. And so kind of you're seeing that downward trend in the 3-month average, which I think is really important to look at. Whenever I talk about, I never will talk about 1 month of data. I always have, you always want to think about what's the trend look like. And this is kind of a slowing trend. And not only was this kind of these headline numbers suggesting a kind of cooling in the labor market, but the kind of guts of the report had some really interesting pieces. So of the 2.6 million jobs that were created according to the payroll survey, and I'm going to talk about, there are 2 different surveys when we talk about the employment report, the payroll and the household. Of those 2.6 million, nearly 2/3 came in 2 sectors, healthcare and government, and in particular, healthcare. And that was not just over the last year, but actually 3/4 of the jobs created in the month of June came from those 2 sectors. So those sectors have been driving growth. The question is that going to continue? Healthcare, long-term demographics suggest, healthcare is a sector that is going to be growing. But is this suggestive of a healthy labor market? I'm not sure. Or I worry about that. I don't think that you can't be just growing on these 2 cylinders alone. Another indicator that came out last week was the unemployment rate. It ticked up to 4.1%. And my former colleague, Claudia Sahm, has created a kind of a rule that's based on the unemployment rate that kind of indicates when a recession has begun. And her rule has not yet been triggered, but it's close to being triggered. Effectively, when the unemployment rate rises 0.5% relative to its low over the last 12 months, then that rule is triggered. And that's where, you can see the gray bars are recessions. And when these things can rise, when it rises over 0.5%, you've had a recession since 1960. So we're close to triggering, but we have not yet triggered. And that's, again, an indicator of a cooling job market and potential risks to the economy. The labor force participation rose ticked up slightly in June, but it's, again, a tale of two different individuals. So prime age, what we call kind of working age population of 25 to 54, saw an increase in participation. But demographics, so a population that's getting older and it tends to have, or older folks have lower participation rates, and you have more older folks, and also you have those older folks, their participation rates are still below COVID levels. So that's what's keeping the overall participation rate, the blue line, below pre-COVID levels, and kind of potential, and demographics are potentially leading it to continue to head downward, that kind of downward trend since we saw in the early to mid, the kind of early 2000s. Going back to the inflation, we had decent wage gains, especially over the last few months or over the last few year or two, and those wage gains have started to outpace the inflation that we've seen. But since the beginning of the pandemic, that gap is only 1.8 percentage points. So this is one of the reasons why kind of people don't feel good, because most of their wage gains have been eaten up by inflation. Most, not all, but that not all is really a more recent trend. And so people are saying, well, look, yes, I've gotten wage gains, but most of it has gotten eaten up by inflation. And people also perceive their wage gains not related to inflation, but related to kind of personal, that they've done a good job. So people say, look, I've done a good job, I've gotten these wage gains, and I lose it all to inflation, which is an important aspect of that perception. Groceries are one of the kind of biggest items that we feel, because it's not necessarily, as you'll see, a largest share of our spending, but we go to the grocery store every day. We know what things cost. That and gasoline are kind of the two biggest impacts on consumer psychology, not necessarily their spending. And grocery prices are up 25%, so more than overall inflation, though, as the Fed will say, but they're up just 1.1% over the last year. So they're growing less than the kind of Fed's target of 2%, but people say, but my grocery bill is 25% on average higher than it was pre-COVID. And there's strong distributional impacts of those grocery price changes. So lower income households spend 11% of their overall spending, or 11% of their overall spending is on grocery prices. The highest income household, that number is 6%. So the pain, and as I indicated, grocery prices rose faster or more than overall inflation. The pain is felt more by lower income households. The same is true, and even to a greater extent, for housing. So we all have been lamenting high housing costs, lower affordability, high rent, rising rents. And so lower income households spend 41% of their income on housing, highest income households 30%. So there's an 11 percentage point gap between those low income households spending on housing and high income households. And so this weighs on, this has the potential to weigh on spending, and kind of that's the concern that I have, that especially low income households will stop spending or slowed their spending, and consumer spending has been a key driver. I think you're also potentially seeing it high income households where high interest rates play a role, high prices play a role, but it's kind of watch those lower income households, watch those lower income households. Speaking about households and their balance sheets, their overall household balance sheets remain healthy. There was a lot of stimulus money. We saved a lot because we weren't going, out to dinner or on vacation. And so you had this build up of excess savings during COVID. And this chart illustrates that we've seen that excess has been drawn down. Interestingly, the black line, which is the bottom 50% households, which you can note have the very low level of savings, or relatively, or very low level of savings relative to the other 50%. Those households actually, by my calculation, their excess savings remains a bit higher than it was pre-COVID. So they've actually not spent down all of their excess savings. The bulk of kind of the spend down has come in that green area, the 50 to 90%. But still, households have less kind of money in the bank ready to spend in an emergency, or to say, look, I'm willing to still go on that vacation, even though prices are higher. So that's a concern. Another concern for households is that you're starting to see pressure on increased delinquency rates. So people are, not paying their credit cards on time, or not paying their auto loans on time. And this is a leading indicator of slowdowns, recessions, consumer distress, because that's effectively saying that these households are unlikely to keep spending. You're unlikely to to go out and spend money on, buy a new car or some discretionary item if you're behind on your auto loan or you're behind on your credit card. And this kind of leads us to, I think I've timed myself well, to the last chart, which is, well, let's look at spending. And unfortunately, we don't have great, we only have an early read of June spending. At this point, Visa has this measure of kind of a spending momentum index. And what this chart is illustrating is that discretionary spending looks to be weaker, which is kind of people going out, that restaurant, going to dinner at a restaurant or going to an amusement park seems to be on a weaker trend than non-discretionary spending. Both of them are under 100, suggesting that we're seeing weakening overall, but more weakening is coming from discretionary spending, which is an indication that these high inflation or high levels of prices that we're seeing, high interest rates, are taking their toll on consumers. More data, we need to see more data to really feel, to see if this is again a soft landing versus recessionary conditions. The cooling in the labor market is still, well in the soft landing camp. But let's see what happens over the next 3 months, 6 months. And I think before we say the Fed before we say it's a fait accompli for the Fed to raise rates, for them to cut rates, I think we need to see more data on the inflation numbers. Everybody was super excited at the beginning of the year that, inflation was coming down, the economy was cooling, and this illustrates that nobody has a crystal ball, and the data came in much stronger than expected, and the inflation remained higher than expected. So it's I think it's the Fed is data dependent, and I think our perspective is data dependent. Let's see what the data looks like before we make any significant calls. So let me stop there and open it up to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Gerald. Lots of ground to cover. Again, it's kind of fun not to be tied to a report that just came out. So I don't know. We may get used to this. Who knows? Lots of things to ask questions about. We don't have a lot in the hopper right now. So I will say to the folks in the audience, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. you're with the press, please be sure to let us know in there so we can prioritize. Also, if you're with us by phone, you can submit a question by email to me. I'm at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. Gerald, I'll start you out with sort of a basic one that we have a lot of time, or we get a lot of the time. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing would mean to CEOs in the Triangle area. I would guess that the idea that government and healthcare is hiring is probably good for this area. I see a lot of government buildings and hospitals around here.
Yeah, I think so. I don't mean to sound like a say the same thing, but I want to focus people on our kind of American Growth Project, where we analyze local economic activity, analyze and forecast local economic activity. And the Triangle has been a significant source of growth. It's actually one of our fastest growing extended metro areas, as we call it. So we think of the government statisticians think of Raleigh and Durham and Chapel Hill as two different metropolitan statistical areas, and we think of them as one. And the Triangle in 2024, we believe, is the third fastest growing large extended metro area in the United States. And that's in some respects because of the strengths, partially it's in areas that are that are strong, like, healthcare, government, but also strong migration patterns kind of per that chart. So you have a lot of domestic migration, so native-born Americans are moving here, foreign-born Americans are moving here. And that is a significant source of growth. We, though, do face housing challenges, and so affordability is becoming an increasing issue. It's definitely not, affordability is still much better than San Francisco, which is why people are moving here from there, or New York, but it's definitely one of the challenges. And so I think the outlook for the Triangle is a quite healthy growth, and this data in some respects supports that story.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought up the American Growth Project because it made me think in our cities that we have put together data on in the American Growth Project. North Carolina has a good number of them. We have 8 different microeconomies in the state. So do you see anything in here that would portray what's coming for some of those areas outside of the Triangle area?
So yeah, Rob, interestingly, so maybe we're going to call it home state bias, or no, there is no bias in this data, but I'm going to say home state promotion. So the North Carolina, as you said, has 8 of these extended metro areas, which is 4th in the nation. So we have the 4th largest number, and we're 4th to Florida, Texas, and California, which, as everybody knows, are much bigger states, I guess, physically and population-wise. Population being the more important aspect of that. And so it's one of the things about it is that it illustrates that there's a very large diversity among outcomes between the different microeconomies. And if we were kind of talking positively about Raleigh-Durham, so our next door neighbor, the Triad in kind of through our extended metro areas, so is expected to have much weaker growth. And that's because of its dependence on manufacturing sector and because of the kind of migration patterns working in reverse. So I didn't specifically call out manufacturing, but in the month of June, you've had job loss in manufacturing. In that other part, manufacturing has been quite weak. And so that's kind of pulling on, is a downward pull on the Triad. And at the same time, as we have staff at the Kenan Institute, we have folks who graduated from, I have a colleague who graduated from UNC Greensboro, and he's working for us. And so kind of within the state, you see these migration patterns where people are moving to the Triangle or to the Triad or to Wilmington. And so those migration patterns are also driving growth. So that's causing some of the economic diversity. And then we have Charlotte with its large finance sector, which is still growing quite nicely. But the finance sector, because of high interest rates, and again, you saw that in the data, is experiencing much weaker or in some cases negative employment growth. And so that kind of shows some of the diversity of the state.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We have an influx of questions. So we're getting close to 9:30, so we might consider all of these lightning round questions, short answers. Let's see. An attendee asked, how can the labor force participation go up, but the number of native-born job holders go down?
So the labor force participation, so when you have somebody, and this is one of the reasons why the unemployment rate went up. So we had a jump in the labor force. So you have people who enter the labor force, or the number of people in the labor force, and then they can fit into two categories. They can be employed or unemployed. And so in the last year, the labor force has increased by about a million people, and this is according to this household survey, but 200,000 of them, or 800,000 of them, have been unemployed. And so effectively, now it's not that those 1,000 that entered, 800 are unemployed, because what happened probably is of those 1,000 entered, most got jobs, but then other people were laid off. So over the last year, you've seen 1,000 people enter the labor force. Of that 1,000, not exactly the same people, 800,000, or on net, 800,000 are unemployed. So they could have entered and are looking for a job, or somebody else lost, got a job and somebody else lost a job, and 200,000 actually were employed. And this is one of the challenges with this data, because we have two different measures indicating two pretty different stories of employment. So that's how that math works.
Okay. From Jiro Yoshida, some say that there are double counting in the employment data when a person has more than one job. So any comment on that?
So in the payroll numbers, you ask companies, do you have a job, or businesses, and it could be small mom and pop businesses they survey, or large companies, Walmart. They say, how many people are on your payrolls? And that's all we know. The number of people on the payrolls. We don't know how many people are working two jobs. So in many cases, those numbers do include multiple job holders. From the household survey, where those numbers I was talking about, that 200,000 jobs created over the last year, they ask people, do you have how many jobs are you working? And so we do know the number of multiple job holders. During COVID, that fell substantially. It had been on the rise. I didn't look to see whether that in the month of June it had continued to rise, and that also is a cyclical indicator. So I should thanks for the question. I should look at that data. But you do have multiple job holders. But again, depending on the survey, it's hard to know which one to know, if that job creation is coming from multiple job holders, in particular industries.
Okay, great. Looks like we might go to 9:35 here. These last questions are all good, so I'm going to give them to you. One from Barbara Sinich. Thank you, Barbara. I agree with you, Barbara. Gerald does do superb analysis. She asked, at what point does 2/3 of job growth coming from healthcare and government workers start to be more than just worrisome? Don't we really need the private enterprise engine to work?
So that's exactly the concern. I mean, and those healthcare jobs can be private sector jobs. They can be, if you're working, for a public hospital, but you're still considered it's a healthcare job. Um, so that's, I mean, kind of, you're pressing harder and putting your finger on my concern. You can't just run an economy on these two sectors, and government can be, some of the government jobs, or much of the government jobs, are in kind of local, and a lot of that has come from a makeup from COVID, when a lot of kind of local governments cut education jobs, and they've now been hiring them back. And so and that's not, it's workers related to education. So if you're a teacher, you're in education, but if you're, these are a bit complicated. But so one of the I think that we will not continue to have the strength in government jobs, and so I think that part is going to fade away. I think structurally we'll have an increase. Healthcare is a structurally strong, but you're not going to have all the health of the economy just in healthcare. So I think that you want to see a more diverse outcome. And so it's the reason, part of the reason to point it out is to say it's worrying. Part of it is to say some of this is making up. We're still kind of having these long-term impacts of COVID. And the question is, can that continue?
Okay, thanks. Last one, 2 sentences or less on this one. Why will the Fed not wait to cut interest rates once they reach their target inflation rate of 2%? Can they reach the 2% target?
So, I mean, for the last 6 months, I have been, and some of my colleagues have been concerned that, this last mile problem for the Fed, and in particular housing, and the housing data housing inflation still remains above previous kind of trends. So housing inflation remains quite high. But even this last month, you actually saw a significant slowdown. So I'll give you a number. Over the last year, housing inflation is 4.4%. It was running closer to the 3% range, kind of pre-COVID. But in the last month, it was up just 0.2%, or at a 2.1% range. And over the last 3 months, it's at a 2.8%. So you're starting to see some slowing in housing. And if you believe that the labor market is cooling substantially, and this is the push and pull, then you want to react early. And that's kind of what Jay Powell is thinking about and talked about in his testimony. It's like, we used to be worrying most about inflation. Now we're worrying about the labor market, and the fact that the inflation numbers are coming in showing slowing trend works in the favor of rate cuts. But that's why we need to wait. Is this just a kind of temporary blip, and we've seen a lot of these, or is this a more, kind of a real trend? And it's too early for me to say, and I think most economists to say.
Okay, I think you used a few semicolons to make that 2 sentences, but that's okay. That's legal. All's fair at the briefing. Thank you very much, Gerald Cohen, for your analysis. Thought-provoking as always. Apologies to the folks who have missed the start of their 9:30. I will get us out of here quickly. Thanks to everyone in the audience. Thanks as always for your very interesting questions. We appreciate it. Thanks also to the folks whose faces you don't see on the screen that make the briefing happen. This morning, that was Juan Lean with graphics and statistics, Corey Powell with his finger on the Zoom buttons, and Robbie Passel on video editing of the video that you will get a link to in your email later today if you want to refer back to anything you saw this morning. For the press and media in the audience, we'd love to continue the conversation. If you'd like to talk to Dr. Cohen or any of our experts, you can reach out to me. Email me at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. We encourage all of you to check out our website at kenaninstitute.unc.edu. It's summer and the campus is pretty quiet. The website, though, continues to churn along. Our grand challenge for the year, business resilience, continues. Lots of new things continuing to go up on the website about that, including one by our frequent host, Christian Lundblad, about radical uncertainty. and how businesses should plan for that I think you'd be very interested in. I think that covers everything. Our next briefing will be on August 2nd. This one will follow the Bureau of Labor Statistics next update, so it will be a normal looking briefing compared to this one, which was kind of not normal. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great Friday.